Welcome to QueerTWENTY by Ego Monk. It is the annual celebration of 20 queer Indians who have made a mark in business, technology, and society. Today we are joined by Anish Gawande, the founder of Pinklist India and Dara Shiko Fellowship. We are happy to have you with us here, Anish. So can we start with a little bit about what went behind the idea of creating Pinklist? Like, what was the driving force?
So I think Pinklist India started off in 2019, right before the Lok Sabha elections, right? And it came about as a sort of longer series of thoughts that were taking place and a larger journey that was taking place that was aimed at sort of providing some sort of hope for young queer Indians who wanted to join politics. So I grew up in Bombay. I, for the longest time, was in the closet, even though I knew I was queer, because I thought that if I came out, I would never be able to enter politics. And growing up, it always seemed to me that my ambition, my desire, my dreams of working in politics or in the public space would never be able to turn to reality if I came out. So there was a sort of self-imposed time in the closet that I spent for almost 4 years. And that was before I went to university. And I went to college and I sort of came out to myself, and then I'd almost given up on any hopes of coming back home and doing anything in the political space, right? And that's when I got an offer to come work as a political consultant for the 2019 elections. And I said, well, I'm out, and a lot of people know I'm out, and this is Indian politics, and I don't think it's the best fit, but why not try, right? So I came back in May 2018 and started working with the Maharashtra Congress and went across the state on their Jan Sangharsh Yatra. And as a queer man going on this journey, it was phenomenally revealing, right? It was one heck of a journey. It was crazy, it was fun, it was all sorts of madness. But what came out of that was this realization that acceptance for queer rights would not come from your traditional progressive politicians. It would come from the most unexpected spaces. So remember that this was a time when Section 377 had not been read down by the Supreme Court of India. It was a time where, since 2013, all of us were in this void wondering whether the court would hear our voice. It was also a time when many of us were realizing that if change had to happen, we'd have to find alternative ways to do it. And one of them was politics, right? And I said, let's tackle this head on. Let's see what we can do with politics. And that's when we started off on this journey to find out what politicians think about LGBTQIA+ rights. And in my journey there, I found that support came from the most unusual sources, like from Raju Shetty, who is a farmers leader from Hataknanga in rural Maharashtra, who said that if I support farmers' rights, how can I not support LGBTQIA+ rights? That would be hypocritical. So that's where the idea came about. I was back in Bombay for the election, and right before sort of the end of the election cycle in May and April, 3 of us got together and we said, let's do something fun around this. And that's how Pinklist India was born.
What do you think should be the role of our political leaders as such, like in India specifically, towards acceptance and recognition of LGBTQ+ rights in Parliament?
So I think there's a need for reframing the conversation around LGBTQIA+ rights, right? It's not about asking them to be inclusive. It's demanding that they be inclusive. You know, we don't take it as a favor if an MP supports women's rights. We don't take it as a favor if an MP speaks up about civic amenities or fixing the gutter in your lane, right? We don't take it as a favor when MPs sort of represent diverse sets of issues. So why should this be any different? I think we've grown to a space in India where we've stopped questioning our leaders. We've stopped demanding better from our leaders. And it's time we realize that, right as the Constitution says, that rights are recognized and not granted by the Constitution. which is a very important tenet of legal philosophy, which says that we are all born with these rights. rights. Constitution simply recognizes them. In the same way, we are born with these rights and our MPs are responsible for ensuring them. So I see the role of every MP to be self-evident. If you're not speaking up on LGBTQIA rights right now, then you're behind the curve. You are failing to represent a large chunk of your constituency and you are not making the ethical choice, right? And if you're not standing for equality, if you're not standing for equal rights, then you deserve to be held accountable. So for me, I think politicians need to be actively pushing for pro-LGBTQIA plus policies. I think they need to be held accountable for making any homophobic or transphobic statements. And more importantly, I think they need to be responsible for cultivating young queer leaders, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well said. So, I mean, could you tell a little bit about your, the experiences that you had during your political journey, like the exposure that you got, and what did you learn? Like, what did you pick up from there?
You know, honestly, the reason I came back, right? So a funny anecdote here is I had a job in New York City. I was sort of very set on staying back. I was like, I'm out. I'm definitely not going to go back to India. And this offer came about. And the first thought that came to my head was, what's the worst that could happen out of this? I'll write a book. A book will come out of it. And there's honestly enough stories to fill many books, right? Because I was traveling for almost 6 months across rural Maharashtra, from Pathadi near Nagar to the Konkan belt, to all the sort of most remote places that I would have never been able to go to, in white pants, pretty kurtas like this, colorful socks and brown Oxfords. While everybody else around me was like on white kurta, baggy white salwar, dirty rubber chappal, right? And it was a very, very interesting thing. Like, I was on stage with all of these people. There's like 40 people on stage. And in the middle of all of these 40 top leaders of the Congress party in the middle of an election campaign in Maharashtra is this 20-odd-year-old skinny kid who's wearing colorful socks and crossing his leg on top of the other with a laptop on his lap, furiously typing away, because I was doing a lot of their press releases and media comms, right? So cutting a very unusual figure in the middle of nowhere, and it was incredible. And the reaction I got was more curiosity, less hate. And people were just genuinely curious. And I think you slowly experiment, right? Like, even with the people you're traveling with, you're slightly pushing the needle a little bit further. So the first few times people would stare, then the next time they're like, oh, where did you get that kurta? Even I would like one like that. And it's you break those barriers slowly but steadily.
At a social level, what do you think is the biggest difference between the US and India when it comes to LGBTQ? When it comes to the LGBTQ community?
I think let's think beyond that, right? I think today we've reached a situation in this country where a lack of diversity is taken as granted, right? In the US today, and I also have worked as a journalist in multiple places from Hong Kong to the US to France, which newsroom would you see where it's acceptable to not have a single black person? What newsroom would you see where it's acceptable to not have a single Asian American? And what newsroom would you see where these conversations are not had at all about diversity and representation? That's India today, right? How many Dalit people are there in our newsrooms? How many Dalit people are there in our organizations, corporate or otherwise? How many queer people are represented? How many trans people are represented? Representation is not taken seriously and is not being considered as part of the conversation. And that's where the problem begins. And unless we have that conversation, unless we push for equal opportunity and equal representation, we're not going to go anywhere. And I think that's a conversation that takes many years. I think it's a conversation we've started having in India now. I hope it's a conversation that will grow. I hope it's a conversation that will flourish, because that's the only way to ensure that there's sort of equality that gets reflected in policy and any decisions that are made.
So, I mean, would you say that lack of representation is the biggest roadblock being faced by the queer community here? Like, all across the world, I'd say?
Absolutely. I'll give you a great example, right? The recently passed Transgender Rights Act, right?
Yeah.
Which has been vociferously opposed by the trans community, is a classic example of governments and individuals thinking that they know better to help people than the people they're helping themselves. How can you create a trans act that the trans community opposes? That's absurd. And that only happens when you're not doing any consultation processes. That's like saying, I'm just going to create something for somebody, but I don't care if they actually support it or not. I've created it. And they're going around tom-tomming it across the world as, oh, India is so progressive on trans rights. When what are they doing? They're asking trans people to strip in front of a district magistrate to prove that they're trans. They're saying that the rape of a trans person is punishable by 6 months to 2 years, whereas the rape of a woman is punishable by 7 years to life. Essentially saying that trans people are second-class citizens. And this utter bullshit only happens when you don't have representation.
Could you just tell a little bit about your personal journey?
So, like I told you, right? Like I came out to myself a long time ago. I came out to myself, I must have been 12, 13. And I was very sure that I was gay. What kept me back was this idea that if I came out, I would never be able to pursue what I wanted to pursue. Right? I would never be able to enter politics. I would never be able to enter public policy. I would never be able to enter law. Because these are fields that as young queer people, we're almost always systematically told are not for us. Right? And that's the genesis of the problem. That growing up, you're told that you can do other things, but this, is not for you. Which is what happens with women as well. That certain professions are not for you. Right? And that internalized sort of feeling of being unable to do something simply because you're queer is what keeps so many people in the closet. That only really changed after the 2013 judgment where there was rage, right? There was rage. There was visceral rage. There was also a lot more that was being spoken about on primetime television. That you had news anchors speaking up. You had journalists speaking up. You had public personalities speaking up and speaking out against 377. And that led to a certain process of emboldenment. And I came out eventually when I was doing a summer sort of job in Paris on a grant that I received from college, because I knew that I knew nobody and nobody knew me. And the only time I felt safe enough to come out was in a place where I was literally unknown. Right? And once that was done, I feel like then it was just, there was no going back, right? And it only got better.